Okay, it's 10:30. I see that we have all of our board members present. Just a little bit of a forewarning, though it all seems to be working fine. I'm doing this from a island off of New Bedford, so if it crashes and burns, I think Jill will pick up the pieces. But right now it seems working fine. So let me call this meeting in the New York State Cemetery Board meeting to order. Just some earlier comments, which has sort of been my habit lately. This is a new era. The meeting's being recorded. We would appreciate if people would identify themselves when speaking each time, because we keep a good record. When the public participation there period comes, we appreciate that you identify yourself. If you can use the chat function, you can raise your hand, and I'll try to do it that way. But otherwise, I'll just sort of call into the ozone to see if people would like to speak. I'm not sure if we're going to go to an executive session. I don't think so. But if we do, we will reconvene to report on the executive session and adjourn the meeting. So again, let me just introduce myself and then the other board members. I'm Mark Pattison, representing Secretary of State Rossana Rosado. Jill?
Hi, I'm Jill Faber, representing Attorney General Letitia James.
Right, Tom.
Hey, Tom Fuller, representing Dr. Howard Zucker for the Department of Health.
Great. So the board members are all present. Just again, I think it's helpful to go over the agenda just ahead of time, but we will have Tony, our counsel, explain the rules, allowing for remote meetings and making sure that we've had the right public notice. We'll approve minutes. We'll get a legislation and rules and regulations report from our council, a division report, a vandalism report, and then we'll present the applications for vandalism. There'll be a motion to discuss them and then discussed by members in a vote. We'll do that on all the applications, and then if we do go into executive session, we'll take a vote to do that. We'll come back out before we adjourn. So let me first ask our counsel, Tony Melillo, if you will talk on the required postings and the rules for allowing for remote meetings.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. This is Tony Melillo, counsel to the Cemetery Board and the division. We are operating under Governor's Executive Order 202.1, which has been extended by subsequent orders that addresses suspension of law allowing attendance of meetings telephonically or other similar service. And the order states Article 7 of the Public Officers Law is modified to permit any public body to meet and take such actions authorized by the law without permitting in-person access to meetings and authorizing such meetings to be held remotely by conference call or similar service, provided that the public has the ability to view or listen to such proceedings and that such meetings are recorded and later transcribed. And this meeting is being recorded and will be transcribed. The executive order has been interpreted to suspend the requirement that board members be physically convened or convened by video conferencing, to suspend a requirement that notice of the meeting include the physical location of each board member who's participating by telephone or similar means. We've given the public notice of the meeting and how to attend by video conference or by telephone conference, and the board agenda and board material have been placed on the Division of Cemeteries website. One final note, we do take attendance. Giving your name and who you represent is voluntary unless you're a lobbyist. Then you must identify yourself and your client. And as Mark said, we ask anyone who speaks to the board to identify themselves. That's it. Thank you. Mark, we can't hear you.
I muted when I wasn't speaking, and then I started speaking. We've distributed the minutes of the last meeting to board members. Does anybody have any changes or corrections to the minutes as distributed?
I don't have any, no.
I don't have any either. Thank you.
So I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as distributed. Can I have a second?
I'll second that.
Great. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. minutes are approved. Um, uh, uh, Tony, do you have any report on legislation and rules and regulations?
Yes, I do. We actually had one bill signed into law. I reported on this bill last month because it passed both houses. This is number 26 on the list. It's the bill that allows cemeteries to pay a website provider to provide the technology to allow internet sales of cemetery goods and services. That was signed by the governor on June 17th. And we have a couple of new additions. They're number 30. Oh, I should give the bill number on that one. That was, when that was signed into law is Assembly 7652, Senate 5591. The new bills, these are the last two on the list. Assembly 10638, it's an assembly only bill. It would amend the Article 15 to move both the Division of Cemeteries and the Cemetery Board to the Department of Health, and would make the Health Commissioner the chair of the Cemetery Board rather than the Secretary of State. Good going there, Tom. And it basically, the justification is that there were issues with that this assembly person saw with the COVID response, and the justification is that the response could be better. If it were to occur again, the Department of Health is better situated to handle those issues. And then the other bill is Bill Assembly 10782. Again, it's a one-house bill. This would make it easier to establish a state veteran cemetery. It eases some of the requirements that lead up to the establishment of such a cemetery. And that's all I have.
Okay, does members of the board have any questions? Tony's legislation report?
No.
Not? Anything else, Tony, in terms of rules and regulations?
I can tell you we have another draft of the regulations. I believe Louis is going to speak on that. Well, for one thing, we've put them in a more an appropriate format that had been in bullet points, but we've also tightened up the language and the restrictions and requirements.
Great.
Now you've shared that with the board already, right?
Yes, that's gone out to the board. That was in my packet.
Right. So I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look at it yet. It only went out a day or two ago, but in broad terms, what the regulations do is the piece that we've written so far. What they will do is they set out factors that define when a cemetery is at risk of abandonment, and say that if we determine based on those factors that a cemetery is in fact at risk of abandonment, we need to report those to the board. We need to report those as a list at each board meeting, and we need to begin a process with the town and the cemetery to try to reconstitute the board and or otherwise address the hold a special lot owners meeting. It's generally reconstitute a board because generally lack of trustees is the biggest issue, but to work with the town, the cemetery, and potentially other cemeteries interested in accepting via abandonment the struggling cemetery to try to keep it from being abandoned. And it sets out steps and rough timeframes for contacting the town, doing an audit, scheduling a special meeting, and letting interested parties know what's going on. Prior to that, and separate and apart from that, not contained in the rules, we're proposing to, when we were just waiting on council's review on this, we got late last week to council, but we've been discussing the concept for a while, is to write to every town in the state and let them know which regulated cemeteries fall within their jurisdiction, make clear to them that trustee lists and annual reports are in our hands and available to them if they want them. Point out that if a cemetery becomes abandoned, it is the town's obligation to maintain and preserve it. and a regulated cemetery, I mean, and also point out that the general municipal law 165-A allows for municipal support in kind or financial to the cemetery, which is presumably cheaper for the town than maintaining it in its entirety. And just sort of opening a line of communication to make sure the towns know what cemeteries they have, et cetera. The letter is not designed to report specifically on the condition of all the cemeteries. We're really only going to do that if one's at risk of abandonment, but just to put everyone on notice that this is out there. As they are right now, the rules stop at the conclusion of a successful reorganizational meeting. They don't really address the piece that happens, well, what if we can't save it? That's still to be written, but the basic concept there is that there will be a determination that the cemetery is abandoned rather than there being a back and forth where we say it's abandoned, somebody says you don't have the right to, so we say, yeah, we do, and then there's a whole like going around in circles. There will be a clear division makes a determination that it's abandoned. Somebody who's objecting can ask the board to hear the matter, something along, broadly speaking, along those lines. And then the other piece that is yet to be written is the piece about how do we deal with a cemetery to cemetery abandonment, which obviously is something we would want to consider where possible, to encourage where possible, because it keeps the burden away from the town. But we have a very vague statute and no regulations on that, and so we need regulations on that. If the board's comfortable, I mean, first of all, if anybody had any reactions to the draft, we'd love to hear them. Second, if the board is comfortable with this, we really ought to share this with affected stakeholders, which I think in this case would be the Association of Cemeteries and the Association of Towns.
Hey, this is Jill. I have one question, and I haven't had a chance to extensively review, and thank you for the summary, Louis. As far as cemetery to cemetery transfers, would we be contemplating that would happen with division facilitation or with an application? You know, do we have an idea of what the mechanism for that would be?
Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, the rules already require the board to approve cemetery to cemetery abandonment. That's one of the few rules we do have.
No, I mean, we have the statute. I don't think we have any regulation that addresses it.
Was that in the statute? That I thought there was somewhere where the board has to approve cemetery to cemetery abandonment.
Yeah, that's in the statute. Give me a minute. Was it 1506-A, I think, or
Dash C,
somewhere?
maybe? Something like that.
Hold on.
This is where a second monitor would come in handy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, 1506-C. And this was
Right, upon application and approval by the cemetery board. It's the
Right.
first words.
Okay.
right. And this was came about by a NISAC bill. It mirrors some of the language in Town Law 261, which declares a cemetery abandoned to a town, but this one is voluntary with the approval of the board. Some of the issues, probably the largest issue we have to deal with when a cemetery takes over a cemetery is there's a distinction between a town takeover and a cemetery takeover. When a town takes over, it really is just obligated to take over basic maintenance, mowing, weeding, that kind of thing. When a cemetery takes over an abandoned cemetery, it's really doing more than that. It's taking title. It's intending to operate the cemetery, generate income through it. So we have to clarify that by regulation because that isn't explicitly set forth in the statute. And we actually have had a few of these, I think at least 3, where a cemetery has taken over an abandoned cemetery. And one of the things the board has always looked at is we want to make sure that it's to the benefit of the cemetery doing the takeover. You don't want it draining funds from that cemetery. Now we have two cemeteries that are struggling under one umbrella. So that's always been a concern for the board in the prior application. So I think we'll make that clear in regulation as well.
Okay. Any other comments or questions from the draft? And again, they're incomplete draft.
I have one quick question. This is only dealing with the regulated cemeteries. What happens if a non-regulated cemetery becomes abandoned?
I'll let Tony answer. We don't have a.
Yeah. The law permits municipalities to take over, certain municipalities to take over certain cemeteries, but there is no requirement. The only explicit requirement is a town takeover. Well, the town has to take over a cemetery that's been operated as a town cemetery. So in other words, it's public land that folks just started using as burial grounds. Besides our cemeteries, that's the only one that I'm aware of where there's mandatory takeover.
So
Everything else is voluntary, and so they just don't happen. In fact, a lot of religious cemeteries just become abandoned, and no one takes them over, and it's a real problem.
well, that's part nowadays, at least. That's where the AG's office comes in, because Jill, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things the AG's office looks like if a religious entity is shutting down or selling its location or what have you, is who's going to maintain the cemetery. I know your office was involved with a couple of religious cemeteries in Westchester, assuring that something would happen when the synagogues that ran them were sold. One of which resulted in some some litigation.
Right, in terms of the approvals and the review that the Attorney General's office needs to do when not-for-profit corporations are dissolving and disposing of assets, and the manner in which those are disposed, that would all fall within that, with the caveat that there are some religious denominations that don't need to seek AG approval for those types of transactions, and those are, by statute, those are designated. But yes, you're correct.
And
General.
broadly speaking, the ones that don't need AG approval, if I remember right, the theory behind it, to the extent we understand it, is that those are ones where there's a quote unquote mothership for the church that can step in and do something.
Yes, where there are strong internal controls on that process, and it's centralized in, to use your words, a mothership. Yes.
So theoretically, a religious cemetery, there should be, if the religious corporation is abiding by the law, there should be a plan of what to do with the religious cemetery if a church is being sold. But we can't explain what's happened in the past.
Correct, and of course that assumes that the church, the religious organization that maintains that cemetery, knows to make application to the Attorney General's office upon dissolution, and actually does so. They do by statute, but sometimes they're not aware, and it doesn't happen. And so that cemetery might find itself in the situation that you described, because that there hasn't been the regulatory oversight by the AG's office.
Right. On this point, where we see where we get calls about problems that obviously we can't do anything about, but where we get the calls, it's not so much if the church is sold or ceases to exist. It's more if the church is less active, less financially able, or changes denomination but is still going.
Mm-hmm.
And they just decide as a going concern to stop maintaining or reduce maintenance of the cemetery. Frankly, we see more problems like that than we do where the church actually ceases to exist.
Mhm. Mhm.
Presumably because you're doing something if there's a 510 or 511 situation.
If they're looking to dispose of, real property or other assets, yes.
Right? I know so what we've done as a practical matter, Tom, is we try to identify, if it's a hierarchical church, we try to identify the bishop or the conference or whatever is above the church, and recommend that the complainant call whoever is above the church to try to get the attention of somebody higher up. That usually works with the Catholic cemeteries. If there's an issue with this Catholic cemetery, calling the diocese usually gets a good response.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the board? Again, these regulations are not only in draft, but they're not complete. But we do want to get informal feedback from stakeholders. Heard that? That's thunder right. So,
The British are firing on you.
yeah. It's hot here at the beach. So we had slid into Lewis's division report. Lewis, is there other things you have in your report?
I have good news. The cremation backlog, to use a term somewhat less than precisely, is a thing of the past for now. We are pretty steady over the last 2 weeks at 150 scheduled cases awaiting cremation more than that day, which leads me to believe that that's actually, since we've never measured this before, we've never had reason to, it leads me to believe that's a normal number. Cemeteries that the selected cemeteries that we survey are operating without delays. I haven't got a complete set of burial numbers for this week, but last week's burial numbers were actually below average for 2019. Again, we're not making seasonal adjustments, so don't read too much into it. But it's certainly at least significant that we're below average burials now, not above anymore. Of course, per the governor yesterday, this could all change if people aren't careful and if the virus comes back from other locations. But right now, things are good, both on the cremation and burial side. We had a call yesterday with other state representatives on the Mortuary Affairs Task Force, the State Association of Cemeteries, and the State Funeral Directors Association. All discussed things we would like to see. And in the case of dishes, things the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, things they are planning to do in the event of a second wave. And I think there's another call scheduled down the road, but there was a lot of good discussion, most of which is still in the discussion phase. But just so as you know, we are all, of course, thinking about this and trying to stay ahead of it. And I think we will. I think it's reasonable. It's reasonably safe to say that even if things got as bad as they were in April and May, we will, in terms of disease, we will not get to that point in terms of final disposition.
Okay, and Lewis, have other things? You have quarterly reports?
Quarterly data. Alicia.
Sure.
Alicia, where is the quarterly stuff?
It's in the board packet.
But it's not in the, it's only in the G Drive piece. Do you have access to it? Can you do that actually?
I have it. So
Yes, so why don't
according
you do it?
to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can, okay. So quarter one, we received 87 rate applications. Quarter two, we received 42 for a total of 129 since the beginning of the year. We have approved 109 of those, leaving 20 outstanding. I suspect that there's more approved than the database reveals, but that's still being cleaned up. We've received one lot reclamation and one has been processed for the year. We have had no net appreciation applications for PM or PC. Rules and regulations received, we had 13 in the first quarter, 6 in the second, and we have approved 17 of those. There was one society reclamation and one has been approved. And those are the board delegated duties.
Thank you. And we'll try to keep up on those on a.
Yeah, we had both compliance issues with investigators, myself not excluded, putting in data into the database, which is only as good as the data we put into it. We also had some issues with the actual ability to crunch the numbers. We have certainly solved the latter, and I think everybody is aware that they have to be better about the former, and I think everything is up to date as of right now.
Okay. Okay. And
Lisa, you want to do the vandalism report too, or do you want me to do it?
You got it in front of you?
See, I'm in the G Drive folder and it's not in the G
Okay.
Drive folder.
Okay. So for 2020 calendar year, we have collected $434,839 in vandalism collections. Assessment collections were $250,092. For fiscal year, from April 1st, 2020, vandalism has been $50,507. Assessments have been $33,260. The entire $2 million appropriation for the calendar year in 2019-20 was spent by March 31st, 2020. $776,397.36 is still unpaid from prior year's applications and should be paid from the 2021 appropriation, leaving $1,223,620.64 available for new applications, assuming another $2 million appropriation.
Well,
We have had,
the $2 million appropriation. We don't necessarily have the cash for sure.
okay.
Is that, Mark, is that
So-
typically the way to phrase it?
We have had approved applications of $147,057.10 for the 2021 appropriation. When we have $101,658.15 going before the board this month.
I've got a different number. Okay,
That's-
so let's move to that. We have two. Any questions about the vandalism report from board members? Okay.
No questions.
Thank
No question.
for vandalism, hazardous monuments. I hope I'm right. It's Oakwood Cemetery in Reynolds County and Howard Cemetery in East Bend. Is that correct?
Yep.
So, is there any report provided on Oakwood Cemetery for $5.78 for hazardous monuments?
Yeah, I mean, it's Oakwood Cemetery in Troy regularly comes in for repair of dangerous monuments. They make it a regular practice to do it. I should point out they are doing their own foundation work. They got to compete per our instructions and per what we've always done. They've got a competing bid on that to show that it is cheaper for them to do the foundation work themselves than to bid out the foundation work. Their charge, this is a question that we've been asked by our fiscal people several times, their foundation charge per this application is based on their approved charge, the division approved charge, board approved charge, I guess technically, for pouring foundations. And so their board approved charge is cheaper than the outside vendor. Other than that, there's nothing really exceptional about the application.
Tony, did you have any comments on this application?
I would note is when you combine the two charges, it does look like what we would be approving, if it's approved, is similar to what other cemeteries pay. So the division of cost between two different entities doesn't seem to inflate the total price. The total price seems to be fair and reasonable.
Right, that's something, just to clarify for the rest of the board, something we briefly discussed at our pre-meeting is, should we, instead of just getting the competing foundation charge, should we bid it as if they were the same person was doing both pieces? So that, because one could imagine that the setting the stone and the repouring the foundation together might be a little cheaper, but this still came in lower.
So, and I'm going to vote on both applications. We're going to, anything we discussed, our cemetery for $35,152.37. Is there anything about the application?
This is one where I would just say, are there any questions?
Tony, did you?
No, I had no concerns about this one. Mark, I'll just note your audio is breaking up.
If it gets too, sort of make it without, but got a here, so that's probably. Question on these two applications. Jill, did I hear you ask a question?
I think, is he asking if the board has any questions?
I
I don't have any questions about either of the applications.
If you can hear me, I'm going to make a motion to approve
Better.
the vandalism application Wood Cemetery in the amount of $66,505.70, and Howard Cemetery $35,152.37. Can I have a second?
Subject to availability of funds.
Yes, I second that.
Thank you, Jill. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
The keeps going. So, have the action of the statement for Ferncliff Cemetery for a long division or doing.
Yeah, I've got that one. Yeah, I wrote this one up myself. So Ferncliff, this is the board approved part of this application last month. It wasn't really quite ready, but they were desperate for inventory, so we approved 100 lawn. You guys approved 100 lawn, or declined to object to installation of 100 lawn crypts. This is the rest of the project. Essentially, what they're doing is extending a section of lawn crypt, building an extension onto an existing section of lawn crypts. It's not your I hesitate to say typical because lawn crypts aren't typical, but it's not your typical lawn crypt project. There are garden type what's the word I'm looking for? There are landscaped areas. There are some features. There's some brick walls. There's some niches included. It's a sort of a creation of a whole aesthetic, which they're going to be bringing across and down a bit of a hill. They've sold the one we approved in 2017 is all but sold out. They made a lot of money on it. They're going to make a lot of money on this. It's going to actually improve the aesthetic of the area, and we think there's nothing to object to. The only thing I'll note is that they now have a new report of an engineer, which was not available at the time when we approved the previous one. They were relying on the previous one on 2017 calculations to some extent. They now have their full engineer's report, recent, which doesn't really matter because Creeder's product, Creeder Vault, who's making the lawn crypts themselves, hasn't changed in 10 years. And they're certifying that it complies with our rules, but we do have a more recent engineer's report on this one. Ferncliff's otherwise, as they were last month, compliant with our regulations, conflict of interest policy in effect, no related parties. And we think that there's nothing to object to here. We think it's a good project for the cemetery.
From a legal perspective, operation and financial issues were discussed on the last application. Nothing's changed since then. As far as the application itself, this is obviously a much larger project than what was approved, but everything else remains the same. So there are no legal concerns. I would again note, as last time, that regulation is written as to whether or not the board objects, not approval. So when the board does decide the matter, it should be, the question should be whether or not there are any objections.
I don't know if you can hear me. Am I? Hello?
Yes, you can. Yes.
Yeah.
A motion, just getting a discussion. I have no objection to this application for Long Trips from Ferncliff. Do I have a second?
I will second.
Are there any questions or discussion from board members on this application?
No questions from me.
So, make the motion. I made the motion. All in favor to approve this application, or not object to this application?
Aye.
Aye.
Carries. The next one is application from for an approved columbarium. They're making a new location. Lewis, you have anything to add to
Yes,
that
Glenwood
application?
Cemetery. What happened is the board previously approved their application. I want to say in March. And then their board realized they want to move the location and they want to have it over by the phase 4 mausoleum rather than the phase 1 mausoleum. We made them repost signs, and the reposted signs are attached to Cindy's report. And we also made them, obviously they need a new comment period based on the new signs. That comment period expires either today or tomorrow, I forget. They've received no adverse comments. And, as the board found when it approved this back in March, there appears to be demand for columbarium. And if they think this is a better spot for us, I'm not going to second guess that. It doesn't raise any of the issues we had with that cemetery in Victor, where it's going to be right up against somebody's property or anything like that. It's still well within the cemetery, away from anything else, and next to a mausoleum building.
Okay. Does council have anything to add on this application?
Yeah, I'll just mention that when the columbarium application is approved, it is approved for the specific site. So it's totally appropriate that this comes back since it's being moved to a new location. And it's also appropriate that it be reposted, since the regulations require that signs go up where it is intended to be located. So that's appropriate as well. It looks like it's been moved from a secluded area, wooded area, further east to a more open, cleared area. Other than that, there seem to be no other changes to the application, and it looks approvable.
I just have a question as to the form of the approval. Now, are we approving this as a new application, or is this, an approval for the move or an amendment to the original, just as to the form of our approval? I'm wondering how that works.
Yeah, that's a fair question. Since the columbarium itself has been approved, I would suggest that this is a request to amend the approval, and that
Okay.
therefore you are amending the approval to authorize it in the new location.
Okay, that makes sense.
Especially because we're not, I mean, we did include all of the financial, but we're not really re-reviewing the whole thing.
Okay, yeah, that was my question, whether we needed to go through that process again, or we can just make this an amendment to the already approved columbarium. Okay.
Makes more sense to me.
So amendment to their previous application for a new look. Do I have a second?
Second?
Any other discussion by board members on this application?
No?
No?
No, we have. All in favor?
Aye.
Last on our agenda, I think, is a application from Lakes Crematory for a new retort. This is something that has sort of, so Louis, you want to view?
Yeah, I'm going to try this, and I'm going to preface this with the caveat that this happened before my time, at least the initial application. What we have before us is everyone's recollection and the historical record. So for originally Finger Lakes wanted to, back in 2012, wanted to add a retort. This was the first time we had a grandfathered standalone make such an application. And we were confronting a couple of issues at that point. The application evolved a bit while it was before us to whether a grandfathered standalone could add capacity. The board ultimately decided no, it cannot, because that's inconsistent with the very nature of grandfathering. We have a legal memo that says that in more legal terms on our website. They also considered the issue of whether a grandfathered standalone could even replace a retort, or whether when the equipment you had as of January 1, 1998 was no longer usable, you were done. And after several meetings and after discussion and hearing from NISAC, members of the public, what have you, the board ultimately concluded that yes, a grandfathered standalone can replace a retort. It cannot add capacity. There was also a wrinkle with respect to the existing retort here. My understanding is that it wasn't really practicable to remove the existing retort. And I want to go to our approval letter because I want to quote this precisely. The division's letter reflecting the board's approval states that, sorry, I just have to page forward to it. I lost it. Hang on, I think it's quoted in the report, so I think that'll be the quickest way to find it. Except, this is where having a second monitor would really come in handy. Okay, my PDF just went completely blank. Let's see. Hang on. So Mike's report states that the letter stated that the crematory that the crematory would quote take quote the existing crematory retort out of service. All right, fast forward to 2017. The newly installed, by the way, that is in fact what happened. The crematory ceased using the old, at least as far as we can tell, based on annual inspections, based on review of logbooks. The crematory.
Sorry to interrupt. I do have the letter in front of me if you want to read from it.
Yeah, I just read the quote from it, but if you want to read the whole thing, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. This was an October 25, 2012 letter to Michael Dougherty, Finger Lakes Crematory, Inc., signed by then Director Richard Fishman. Mr. Dougherty, dear Mr. Dougherty, your application for a major renovation to take your existing crematory retort out of service, but not out of the building, and to install a new retort without increasing the building footprint and without increasing cremation capacity has been reviewed at previous meetings of the New York State Cemetery Board and was again reviewed at a September 27, 2012 meeting. Requirements of Cemetery Board Directive 201.16 was satisfied and the division recommended approval of the application. The board first determined that a funeral home / crematory combination, which is grandfathered from the prohibitions of the anti-combination law, may replace an existing retort with a new retort as long as the crematory building footprint is not increased and cremation capacity is not increased. A motion was then unanimously passed by the New York State Cemetery Board, granting the cemetery permission to proceed with the renovation and taking the existing crematory retort out of service and installing a new retort. End of letter.
Okay, thanks. So fast forward to 2017. The crematory apparently needed to do maintenance on its 2012 retort and had to take it out of service. They contacted the division, and an investigator from the division emailed them saying essentially that you can run your old retort while the new one is being serviced. When that ended, the crematory stopped using its old retort, resumed using the new one, and has not, to our knowledge, and again, we have looked at the logbooks, used the old retort since then. So now we have an application to replace the old retort, which is not going to be compliant with DEC's regulations when they take effect in 4.5 years, with another retort to be used for backup when the first one is down. Having re-reviewed the entire record, we think it's pretty clear that the board's approval did not contemplate having a second retort for backup. The retort was supposed to be taken out of service. Out of service doesn't mean out of service except when we can't run the other one. It means out of service. If that's the case, adding a new retort to replace the one that's supposed to be out of service is in fact pretty clearly increasing capacity. The only thing I'll add to it on that point is that if having a 2020 quote unquote backup retort to a 2012 retort as compared to a 2012 retort and a 1976 retort, even though you're only supposed to be using one of them anyway, that by itself seems to me to be very clearly increasing capacity, regardless of the scope of the original approval. So we can't recommend approval of this, and we think essentially that if you wanted to try to characterize this legally, we think essentially this is asking the board to reconsider its decision in 2012. And we don't really see any basis for the board reconsidering this. There's been a lot of law that's gone under the bridge since 2012, most notably the litigation over Sheridan Park, which we think makes clear that the purpose of grandfathering is you get what you got as of January 1, 1998, and that's it. If you're just replacing a piece of equipment, but otherwise staying the same, you still have more or less what you had as of January 1, 1998, if you're replacing with a similar piece of equipment. But that doesn't allow you to put in more equipment.
Okay, so the division is
recommending that the board either deny this application or adhere to its previous decision. I'll leave it to council as to which of those is more accurate as a legal matter.
Thank you. Tony, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to amplify the background. 2012 seemed to be the year of the grandfathered combinations. The three issues came to the board that are reflected on the memo that's on Division's website. This one, whether a crematory can add a retort. Another issue was whether a crematory could move to a new location, a grandfathered combination. And the third was whether when a funeral home gets transferred to a new owner, does the crematory go with it? They all happened in 1 year. The reason this stretched, the application was first put in front of the board in March 2012, and a final decision was rendered in September. And the reason it stretched so long was because these were novel issues, and the board sought to be briefed on all of them. We also even got an attorney general opinion on some of the issues. The record's clear that when it came to the board in March 2012 to add a retort, the board said no. It denied that application. And then when it came back in April, they still seemed to be seeking to add a retort, and the board asked them, would you consider instead replacing the retort? And the answer was yes. And that's in the minutes. And from April on, the issue then was whether a crematory could replace a retort, since that by itself would increase capacity and extend the life of the grandfathered combination. And in fact, NISAC submitted a brief saying that these grandfathered combinations should not be allowed to replace their retorts when the original retort no longer becomes usable. The combination should end. That was the position of NISAC. And the board ended up not adopting that position. And the biggest motivation, I think, was because modernizing the retort meant a cleaner, more efficient retort. And so they didn't want the possibility that a grandfathered combination would keep using an old retort well beyond when it should, and the environmental and costs that would entail. So the board ended up permitting replacement of a retort, but just to, the memo that's on the website was approved by the board, and the language in that memo was approved by the board. And I'll just read from that because it really gives a good description of what happened. This is the last paragraph of the memo. It says that the third issue brought before the board was whether the operator of a grandfathered crematory could add a new retort or replace its existing retort. Crematory was operating a retort that was old and inefficient. The operator sought to add a new retort but keep the existing retort as backup. The additional retort would fit in the existing crematory building. Previously, the Division of Cemeteries had taken the position that a grandfathered combination could replace its retort as long as the footprint of the crematory building was not increased. This application was brought before the board because it involved not just replacing a retort, but adding a retort, and because the work qualified as a major renovation requiring board approval. The board once again determined that the grandfather provision only protects what the crematory operator had at the time the law was passed. Adding an additional retort and thereby increasing capacity would go beyond what the crematory operator had and therefore was not permitted. The operator then modified his application so that the new retort would replace the old retort. Or determined that this was permissible since the operator would not be expanding the crematory, would not be increasing its cremation capacity, other than the incidental increased capacity that comes from having a more modern, efficient retort. The board also noted the environmental benefit that would come from allowing such crematories to modernize their equipment. So really, all that the crematory has submitted is that 5 years later, a division staff person who was not present at those 2012 meetings told them, yeah, they could run the old retort as a backup while the new retort was out of service. What that division staff said to the crematory was against what the board had approved. The board did not approve using that old retort as a backup. It allowed the crematory to keep it there to save the cost of removing it. But as Louis said, they were told to disable it and take it out of service. It should never have been operated again. And certainly replacing it would be in conflict with both decisions of this board, the March decision and March 2012 decision prohibiting them from adding a retort, and the September decision only allowing them to replace it. So I think the record is exceedingly clear, and they would be asking the board to reopen
Yeah.
lengthy review, which
Yeah, so-
I don't know that the board wants to do. So I think the board, just to finish, should reject this application as a matter that's already been decided.
So that's they sent it in. I did want to make sure the board affirmed its was prepared to not necessarily review, but confirm earlier decisions unless they had some other reason to do so. My recommendation, and is similar to the divisions, that this is settled. This has been, Louis, communicated to the cemetery.
Counsel for the crematory, yes, and counsel for the crematory is on the call
Right.
and presumably
So if
wants
they
to.
would like to speak, then this is the time for them to do so.
Peter, are you still there? He was here before.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for allowing me to make a little presentation today. Members of the board, Mr. Polishuk, Mr. Mamalalo, members of the division, members of the public. My name is Pete Skivington. I'm the attorney for Finger Lakes Crematory, who, as council has stated, has made applications to remove an outdated, environmentally unsound retort and install a new state-of-the-art retort strictly and solely as a backup. I've reviewed the package the board members have in front of them today, which includes our application, my letter, a letter from the president of Finger Lakes, and also has the memorandums of Ms. DeYoung and Mr. Seelman. I've reviewed Ms. DeYoung's memorandum based upon her review of the financials of Finger Lakes. And although she says she can't make a recommendation from a financial point of view, she does offhandedly recommend it because of the benefit that it might serve for the community. I've looked at Mr. Seelman's recommendation, which is to vote against the application of Finger Lakes. And my review of the decision indicates that the only reason for recommending rejection is because it's inconsistent with the previous board decisions. I will say, I don't know if Mr. Seelman is in the meeting today, but the facts show that it's Mr. Seelman that recommended to the Finger Lakes that they make this application before the board. In fact, each time it was inspected, it was noticed that this 1974 retort was totally out of touch with reality. And the recommendation from the division, representatives anyway, was that since you were not increasing the footprint and you're not increasing capacity, that it's a good idea from a public interest point of view to have a retort there in case the existing retort goes down for any reason. And this was ultimately accentuated by the COVID-19 pandemic development, because Finger Lakes was contacted by, I'm not sure it was the division or who it was, to participate if necessary to help with the unreasonable load that New York City was experiencing. And I believe the division representatives thought that it would be a good idea to have a backup in the event we revisit what we're going through now, whether it be in the fall or in the year 2021. So with that recommendation, the Finger Lakes did an investigation of how much it would cost to put a backup retort in. They found that the old retort was asbestos laden so that it would remove all the health hazards to the public that may exist. And because of the manner in which our not-for-profit is organized, the Finger Lakes savings account has plenty of cash in order to make the investment of this replacement retort. I have to disagree with Mr. Polishuk, of course, and Mr. Malello that this is in conflict with the previous board's decisions. The decision of the previous board was to allow the old retort to be replaced by this new retort as long as the footprint was not increased, which it was not, and the cremation capacity was not increased, which it has not. And I will say that Finger Lakes has been in compliance with all the rules and regulations of the board since it was allowed to replace that old retort. The director pointed out that the old retort does not meet the DEC regulations. It's essentially a health and fire hazard as it exists at the crematory today. I would point out, and I had the opportunity to look at the board's website, the recent decision that you made to allow a cemetery to increase its retorts by 2 to meet the pandemic, the unfortunate pandemic situations that we're all facing now. I'm not aware of anything in the previous decisions that prevent an undated, environmentally unsound backup retort in an existing footprint to still exist. I will point out, and I did point out in my letter, and I think the president pointed out in his application, that the capacity of this crematory will not increase. I compare this to whether it be a school or a hospital or any other institution that installs a generator to provide a backup in the event the power goes down. That's what Finger Lakes is trying to do here. In the event we face another situation like we're facing now or some new virus, and the main retort should be inoperable for any reason, that this retort would be available to maintain the public interest and to maintain the public demand. I'm not aware of any real reason from a health point of view or from a legal point of view why this application should be rejected. This will not in any way affect any other cemetery in Western New York or anywhere else in the state. And the division, because of the nature of the retort that would be installed, a 2020 retort, would have the capacity of supervision to make sure that this retort is never used at the same time of the existing retort. There isn't any question before the board that Finger Lakes has ever done that before, and they have no intention of doing it now. But I will point out that they have an existing building. If the new retort was put in, no one could tell that there's a new retort in the building. It would use the same footprint. It would not involve alteration of the structure in any degree. And in fact, would be a public benefit by virtue of getting rid of the asbestos and the old machine that can never really be used again. I'm not aware of how a denial in this case would benefit anyone in the state of New York, any of the people in Western New York. Finger Lakes has the funds to do this and believes it's in the best interest of not only the division, but the people in Western New York. And I don't see that there's any precedential effect to this that's going to be long lasting or change the previous decision of the board. This is strictly a reason to provide a backup in the event the one becomes inoperable or is down for a period of time for maintenance. With that said, I would encourage the board members to consider my points before making a decision. It's my understanding that, the cemetery board is here to protect the interest, obviously, of cemeteries, as well as the public interest throughout the state of New York. And I can't come up with a reason why this would have any effect in a negative fashion to either cemeteries or the people that unfortunately have to use crematories as we move forward. I'd be happy to answer any questions of any of the board members. I don't believe there's any facts that are in dispute here. It's really just under the previous decision, which I have in front of me, doesn't mention anything about not having an up-to-date backup retort that would serve the members of the community. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
If anyone would like to address any questions to me, I'd be happy to answer those
Thank you,
today or by subsequent submission if you feel it's appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Skivington. Is there anyone else that would like to address this matter?
Sorry, just a quick response. I just want to make clear. When I spoke to Mike at some length about the issue, about his discussions with the crematory, Mike can't join us because he's on vacation. But hold on 1 second. Hi, sorry about that. I have contractors walking through the house in the middle of the meeting. So I spoke to Mike about some length about that, and we absolutely told the crematory that if they want to try to replace the retort, they'd have to apply to the board. We also, I think, made clear that we didn't know whether the board would allow it. And we were, when we first started looking at this, I did not know, I had not read the old minutes, and I did not have access to the board, to previous director's approval letter. So I didn't know when we got the application what the exact terms of this was. One thing I will say is that we do agree with Mr. Skivington. There hasn't been, we have absolutely no reason to believe that the crematory has done anything other than as described when it ran the other retort as backup.
Do any board members have any other questions of Mr. Skivington?
This is Jill. I don't have any questions, and thank you, Mr. Skivington, for your presentation. And I certainly understand the crematory's position, but with the caveat that I was not on the board at the time that the previous decision was made. When I look at the deliberations that occurred and what came out of those deliberations and the decision, it seems clear to me that while that old retort, the 1974 retort, remained on site, the intent, and I think it was expressly discussed, was that it was on site only because it would be expensive and unnecessary to physically remove it, but that the approval for replacing it was really made in conjunction with the express understanding that for all intents and purposes, that one was never to be operational, and there was not to be a backup. It was never determined that that could remain as a backup. It was remaining only on site, only in lieu of the onerous process of physically dismantling and removing it. If that's inconsistent, if there's something that you're aware of that. But in my review of the process in 2012, I think that was clear that was what the board was approving, which to me makes this application and any consideration of what you're asking inconsistent with the decision that was made in 2012.
May I say something?
Sure.
Now, I do have Mr. Fishman's letter in front of me, and we, obviously, Mr. Fishman was the go-between between the division and the board back at the time this matter was decided, but I do think his last sentence or his last paragraph sets forth what the board decided. First of all, they decided in favor of the funeral home that you could continue with the new retort. That was one of the big issues that we had back then. And then he says, may replace an existing retort with a new retort. And here's the conditioning language. As long as the crematory building footprint is not increased and cremation capacity is not increased. Well, this application for this backup retort will not result in either of those happening. So I don't really think the board considered it specifically back in 2012. As I know, I did not make an argument, as far as I know, whether there should be a backup or there shouldn't be a backup. It was not contemplated between Finger Lakes and the board. Obviously, we were more concerned at that point whether the board was going to decide when the retort became unusable, did Finger Lakes Crematory come to an end? Thank God the board resolved that in favor of my client, and then the rest was just language at that point. But I believe it's set forth in Mr. Fishman's decision. And I do think, and I would address this, of course, to the Department of Health, that it's in the best interest of the residents of the state of New York that there be, make sure that this crematory, which acts as generally the only crematory in the southern tier or the Finger Lakes area that's able to serve residents, is operational at all points in time. And I will point out, although I don't really think it's an issue, that the division will have supervisory control because these have now computers in them. So that if you use it, it's going to be easily seen by the division. And Finger Lakes has no intent of doing that. But they have the funds. It's in the best interest of the community. Doesn't increase the footprint. Will not increase capacity. I'm not really aware of a counter argument to that other than saying that this wasn't contemplated by the board back in 2012. But, and you know, we're all facing why we're having this video today is because we have these health concerns, and Finger Lakes is trying to make sure that they can serve the members of the public in the event this continues or we face this again. That's my argument. I do think it's based in logic. And I'd hate to see you just rely on, I don't know what you want to call it, stare decisis or something like that. Although it's not really on there. This is 2000, almost 2021. That was 2012. I would just urge you to look at it from strictly a public health point of view as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Skevington. Does any other board members have any questions or anything to add?
Not at this time.
So I agree with Jill, as Mark Patterson. I think that it's not really about public interest, about what the statute said about anti-combination and the decisions board's longstanding policy not to increase capacity. I think it's clear from the record that they did contemplate the issue of backup. They wanted it dismantled, taken out of service. So I agree that this has already been decided and is not really subject to review. I'm not sure what form the motion should take, but I think I did want it to be brought before the board for this discussion so that everybody else would have an opportunity to speak. But I would make a motion subject to amendment by council that we affirm the recommendation of the division and the previous decision of the board in 2012. Do I have a second for purpose of discussion?
I will second that.
Second from Tom Fuller. Any other discussion on the matter of the board members, in terms of that motion? Tony, is that an acceptable motion?
I think just a little addition, that approval of this would be inconsistent with the prior decisions, and the board is adhering to those prior decisions.
But
Okay.
by prior decisions, just to clarify, I think you're not just referring to the decision on this matter, but the board's prior decisions interpreting the grandfather clause.
Actually, I was personally referring to the March 2012 and the September 2012 decisions that were
I just didn't
specific
know
to
whether,
this
okay.
application.
Yeah, I
Okay.
didn't know if this also would implicate whether there ought to be reference to decisions, say, with respect to Sheridan Park that got litigated.
No, I made that motion just specific to this decision.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough.
And I mentioned the 2012 decision. So if there's no other discussion, all in favor? Aye.
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 Okay, so that affirms the recommendation of the board, the division, and the previous decisions by the board on this matter. Okay, so next business is the next meeting date is August what? Louis?
Sec, I think it is August 12th. Let me, hold on a second. Sorry, I'm having trouble.
This is why I send the things out ahead of time, Louis.
No, I know, no, just August 11th. Sorry.
11. We have people here who might wish to speak to the board, members of the public. If you do, identify yourself. Is there anybody that wishes to speak to the board? David?
Yes, if no one else, David Fleming from the New York State Association of Cemeteries. Thank you for continuing to keep us apprised of the developments of the proposed regulations. Obviously, we look forward to working with council and the division on the language, and we appreciate that opportunity. I just want to thank also Director Polishuk and the New York Mortuary Task Force team for great discussions yesterday about how we can all work together, responding to not just a potential second wave of the pandemic, but additionally any other pandemics that come down the road, that we can respond in a way that's reasonable and fast. And, obviously Mr. Fuller's been a tremendous resource throughout the entire process and is very responsive. So we appreciate that very much. And, we look forward to getting some additional steps solidly in place so we can respond, and hopefully that we never have to respond as we've had to deal with the last, several months. And again, on behalf of the association, thank you for the 7 days a week of work that many of you have put in helping us, our members, respond to a very difficult situation and to help the families that we serve. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Is there anybody else wishing to speak to the board, members of the public? I don't see anybody else raising their hand. I don't think we need executive session, so I will make a motion to adjourn the July meeting of the New York State Cemetery Board. Do I have a second?
Second.
Jill seconds. 10 seconds away from being back on vacation. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate your efforts and your work to get this meeting together. So thank you, and we'll see you in August.
Thank you.